Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this webinar, which is sponsored by the European Open Science Cloud, the EOSC. This webinar is executed on behalf of the EOSC Secretariat, the International Initiative Work Packages, with the help of Trust IT for the logistics. My name is Bert Meerman, and I'm from the FAIR Foundation in the Netherlands. And it's my pleasure to open today's session. Federico, can you put on the next slide, please? Now, before we go into the focus area of this webinar, I would like to say a few things about trends. And in the last 12 months, we've seen a number of very interesting converging trends in the world of open science. And of course, the next hour, we will discuss a very important one. To give you a flavor in terms of what has happened and what is happening worldwide, let me inform you on three things which I picked out. There are more trends, but I just picked out three. First of all, we've seen open science clouds in Europe, Asia, Africa, and in the US, all cooperating with each other, which I think is a very positive trend. We've seen also many science funders teaming up, demanding better structured data from researchers and also requiring researchers to adhere to the FAIR principles, and an excellent trend, I would say. And we've seen also universities and institutes hiring data stewards, helping the researchers with machine actionable data management plans and assisting the researchers with making data fair. So these are excellent trends. And the next hour, we will discuss most likely the most interesting trend, which is the fact that global data standard organizations are cooperating and working towards common goals. And we are talking here about WDS, CODATA, RDA, and FAIR, who defined as organizations in a document called Data Together, the fundamentals for this cooperation. Now, in this webinar, we want to better understand what impact this cooperation may have on the EOSC, and the other way around. Federico, can I have my second slide? So as you see, we have a great lineup of speakers this afternoon. We really have the executive power of all these organizations at the table this afternoon. We'll first hear from Ingrid Dillo. She will be explaining what the Data Together cooperation entails. And then we will hear from Mark Leggott, from Barend Mons, and from Hilary Hanahoe about their views, current and planned examples of this cooperation. And finally, we have asked Simon Hodson from CODATA to manage the Q&A sessions. You can post your questions via the chat as usual. I think that is it in terms of my intro. I wish you all a very fruitful webinar. And thank you very much for dialing in. I would now like to give the word to Ingrid Dillo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bert, and welcome everyone. As the first speaker in this lineup, I have the pleasure to introduce to you the Data Together initiative. And in my talk, I hope to answer two questions. First of all, what is Data Together? And secondly, how does the community benefit from it? Next slide, please. Here on this graph, you see the four organizations that together form this initiative. The two eldest organizations are both interdisciplinary bodies of the International Science Council. First of all, there is CODATA, the Committee on Data. CODATA was created already in the 1960s and had a mission to improve the management and preservation of scientific data and to facilitate coordination. And I think that element, especially of coordination, still resonates in the mission of CODATA nowadays, which is to connect data and people to advance science and improve our world. The second of these bodies of the International Science Council is the World Data System. the predecessor of the World Data System were the World Data Centers, and they were already created in the 50s of the last century, with the aim to archive and distribute data. In 2008, the World Data Centers were transformed into a new organization called the World Data System. And that organization nowadays has a mission to promote long-term stewardship of and open access to trustworthy data and data services. And then the other two organizations are relative newbies, you could say. The Research Data Alliance is the first one, and the RDA was set up in 2012 and funded by the National Science Foundation in the US, the European Commission here in Europe, and the Australian government. So it was an initiative taken from 3 different continents. And the RDA aims to build the technical and social bridges to enable data sharing and data reuse. And then finally, the 4th organization in this initiative is GoFair. And the Global Open FAIR organization was created in 2017 with a focus to support fair sharing and reuse of data and related tools. Next slide, please. So I think it's already clear to you from the previous slide that these 4 organizations share a number of characteristics. They're not nationally or regionally focused, but they all have really and truly a global mandate from their respective constituencies. Furthermore, they are all independent and impartial, and they are not domain specific. They are generic organizations, and they operate on a supra-disciplinary level. And finally, you could also say that they are all very strategic and pioneer organizations, and they are working really at the forefront of developments in the international data landscape. Next slide. Of course, there are also fundamental differences between the 4. Each organization has, of course, its own unique way of working, and this relates, of course, from the different origins and the different histories in terms of their main processes and workflows, their governance and advisory bodies, and of course, their outputs. And they also serve partially different stakeholders. They also have different mandates, different strategies, and different funding mechanisms. But you could say that despite all of that, we as 4 organizations do share objectives, and we also serve definitely overlapping communities. So we believe really that we will create more efficiency if we try to coordinate our work in a transparent way and work together on certain topics. And this will probably help us to also achieve the objectives that we all share, as well as the objectives that we have for each of our organizations independently. Next slide. This is a nice infographic that is, let's say, the result of a kind of inventory, a comparison, if you will, where you see in different layers the core missions of the 4 organizations, their main processes, and their main outputs. And I'm not going to jump into every detail, but if you have a look at it later on, you will definitely see that there are differences. For example, CODATA has a strong focus on policy development, whereas an organization like WDS concentrates on promoting trust and providing hands-on technical support to repositories. RDA really concentrates on best practices and standards and ICT technical specifications, while GoFair has a focus more on implementation guidelines for fair data. So there are definitely differences, but you will also see that there is certainly a kind of degree of overlap in all of these 3 layers. And that is where there is an opportunity to work more closely together. Next slide. So, of course, there are already working relationships between the different organizations. There are MOUs between some of the organizations, and there are also affiliate memberships, partnerships. For example, in RDA, there are groups in which CODATA and WDS work together with people within RDA, and also FAIR is quite involved in different groups. And another example of an area where we work together is the International Data Week, which is a week-long event that is held every 2 years and is organized by RDA, WDS and CODATA together. And we have seen editions of it already in Denver and in Botswana. And in 2023, we will have a next meeting, a next International Data Week in Salzburg, Austria. Also, CODATA and FAIR organize events together, and there is a nice example, and I think it's next week, where those two organizations organize the International FAIR Convergence Symposium. So a lot of activities and connections already. But the original reason for this Data Together initiative, really the incentive also for me personally to set up the very first meeting of the leadership of the 4 organizations, was the fact that we received signals that it was not clear to the data community and probably also to other stakeholders, I guess, why these 4 organizations exist next to one another and whether and how they differ from each other. So we met for the first time in the fall of 2019, and we decided at that point in time really to first focus our work on making clear to the wider community who we are, how we relate to one another. And we worked on a joint statement on that to set the scene and explain and try to answer those questions. And you see that statement here on the screen. It was published last spring, and you can see the 4 references on to that document on the websites of the 4 organizations. Next slide. So where are we now? We have concentrated a little bit on the process. So of course, we will continue the already existing collaborations that we have. We will also continue now the regular meetings that we have between the secretariats of those 4 organizations, and also the leadership meetings that we will organize 3 or 4 times a year. And all of this is really meant to inform one another on developments, to align our work, and to define areas where we will collaborate. And at the moment, we're at the point that we are discussing the definition of a kind of shared agenda for the coming years of areas in which we plan to work together. Next slide. So then, of course, the question is, what does Data Together offer the European Open Science Cloud? And to build on what I said earlier on, I think that we believe that the Data Together initiative will allow for more transparency and efficiency and alignment also in the work of the 4 organizations for all stakeholders, including the EOSC. And as for really international and generic data organizations, we expect to be able to supply also support, to provide support to the EOSC for policy development, and also more specifically in the context of the implementation of a FAIR ecosystem that we need to realize open science and the European Open Science Cloud. And furthermore, we also believe that we can support the EOSC in really aligning its efforts with international work and the international context. And of course, this is a kind of 2-way process. On the one hand, there is the possibility to learn from international knowledge and expertise, and to make sure that we are within Europe, within the EOSC, not reinventing wheels that already exist. And the other way around, it also provides an opportunity to bring EOSC outputs, EOSC work and ideas to the international communities. And in that sense, I think the Data Together initiative can also provide support for best practices, the development of standards, and also interoperability around the different open research commons that we now see appearing around the globe, in the US, in Australia, China, and of course in Europe with our own EOSC. So with that, I hope I have given you some idea of what Data Together stands for. There will be ample room at the end of this webinar for questions and comments. And I would now like to hand over to Mark Leggott to introduce to us the COVID-19 initiative of RDA, but not before I say a little bit more about my last slide that I completely forgot, but that is there, to finally emphasize that we do not have the intention between the 4 organizations to transform this Data Together initiative into a kind of formal body, but that it is really meant as a kind of coalition of the willing to make sure that we serve the community even better than we have up till now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ingrid. So I'm going to focus in on a particular example of a RDA activity with the COVID-19 working group. I should highlight from my own personal perspective, aside from being a council co-chair on RDA with Ingrid, I'm also the chair of CODATA's International Data Policy Committee, and members of Research Data Canada, like our chair, David Castle, are also heavily involved in EOSC and WDS. So there is a pretty extensive intersection, not just on an institutional basis with Data Together, but also with some of the personal connections and roles. Next slide. So just as a bit of background, the request for the original effort, which culminated in the report that the RDA community prepared, came from the European Commission in March, April of this year. And the request was if RDA could galvanize its grassroots community to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic by creating a set of guidelines and recommendations on data sharing. So with Hilary Hanahoe, who you'll hear from in a few minutes, so with her leadership and the quick discussion in council, a working group was set up within a couple of weeks, got started in early April. Because of the specific focus that the European Commission had requested, we created 4 research areas, which I'll describe in a minute. As discussion ensued, we also decided to add an additional 4 cross-cutting themes that ran across all of the research areas. So each of those 8 thematic contexts, if you will, each had a set of co-moderators, typically 2, sometimes 3. And those co-moderators met many times a week over the course of April to June. So and there was also a set of 7 co-chairs. We decided to have a substantial number of co-chairs who could also sit on 1 or more of these 8 thematic areas to facilitate the conversation and kind of provide a conduit back to the co-chairs group. When you consider the 7 co-chairs and a dozen plus moderators, as well as an editorial team, which was focused towards the end of the timeline on bringing all of these 8 different documents, as well as introductory material, back to a common language, if you will, and to bring it all together into a more seamless document, as well as a small visualization team that looked at additional ways to facilitate the guidelines and recommendations. You can well imagine that the effort required to facilitate an initial group of over 600 volunteers to do some work within the course of 2 months that would normally take at least 18 months in the traditional RDA working group context. You can imagine the effort that was required. As it turned out, at the end of the day, there were probably just under 200 individuals from the RDA community that were quite active. And of course, when you look at those active individuals, many also had involvement with the other Data Together organizations. All of them, FAIR, WDS, and CODATA, had representatives both from the organizational context as well as from their member communities who participated. VODAN from the FAIR effort is a good example. The basic approach that RDA took when moving the project forward was to have a series of sprints. So those sprints were essentially documentation sprints. So each of the 8 thematic teams crafted documents through a process of 6 releases over the 3 months, culminating in the final release at the end of June. We also had a series of, I think at the end of the day, it was 6 public webinars, which were intended to inform the broader community, not just on our progress, but also it served as an outreach effort, and additional members joined the effort. So that effort I'll describe in a few minutes. I did want to just highlight as well that, as you can imagine, after 3 months producing a 140+ page document, as well as a bibliography represented by a Zotero library that's over 1,000 individual canonical references, that the effort of not just creating that was substantial, but also the ongoing effort of maintaining that exists. So those ongoing efforts will be seen through the continuation of the COVID-19 working group, possibly through the emergence of what the RDA calls a community of practice, in this case, an infectious disease community of practice, to consider the broader implications and impacts of the guidelines and recommendations that were created in infectious disease writ large, rather than just on the COVID-19 context. So aside from that initial sprint, there's a number of additional working groups, interest groups, and as I say, potentially this community of practice that will continue. So again, this kind of illustrates an atypical version of the international data community coming together around a particular best practice, in this case, data sharing in the context of COVID-19. So it's an excellent example of how agile these 4 communities can be, and it also is an indication of the value of that community platform that RDA presents. Next slide. So with that kind of background, this was the result of the sprints and the final document. Across the top are the 4 thematic areas that we focused on: clinical, omics including genomics, metabolomics, lipidomics, proteomics. So it was kind of all the various sciences within that broad umbrella: epidemiology and social sciences. So those were the 4 focuses that we were asked to continue with. And then from the beginning, but then adding 1 or 2 additional ones as time went on, we also had a cross-cutting theme of community. So what's community participation look like in a COVID-19 context? Research software. How does the software that is used and created during this kind of intensive research process, what are the best practices there? Indigenous data guidelines. That was the group that was pulled together probably later in the cycle than any of the others. And that was, again, a group that focused in on Indigenous data sovereignty, the issues of data collection, ownership, and those kinds of things. And it was largely based on the CARE principles, which had emerged previously. And then the final one of the 8 was the legal and ethical considerations. To some degree, this was one of the critical ones, but also one of the more challenging and complicated ones, because the legal and ethical considerations are the ones that vary quite substantially from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So one of the additional outputs that the group came up with is using a tool called the Data Stewardship Wizard, which started as a tool to create data management plans and was, in a sense, repurposed without making any changes to the code to duplicate the full 140 pages of the original guidelines and recommendations in more of a decision tree type context that a stakeholder group could go in and kind of produce a custom output for their user community. So that's an example of what can happen when the data community comes together. The fact that it used a particular starting point in terms of the RDA community, to my mind, is an interesting aspect of the whole equation. But I think the fundamental strength of the data together and the four collaborating organizations is how they are able to galvanize their respective communities to come together around a topic like this. So I think I will end there because I know there's additional content. I'd like to leave some time for questions as well. So Barend, I think you're next.
Yes, thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you, Mark. So I would like to speak about a initiative that was initially taken by FAIR. This is called the Virus Outbreak Data Network, VODAN. But I want to emphasize a number of things here. First of all, I think within a week, or at least very fast, we came together with the Data Together partners. And we not only had the Data Together document, but you can see highlighted here also a statement that we collectively made about what was the very broad approach of distributed learning because the data cannot be shared across national borders, etc., etc. And I think that also emphasizes one aspect that I think was not emphasized yet. That is that not every action needs to be taken by all four of us, but we can endorse. So what we did, we endorsed with all of us, the RDA working group that Mark just presented, but also VODAN was endorsed very early on. And I would argue that helped really to bring people together to get some funding. FAIR is not a funding agency. It works with implementation networks. This is an implementation network. But very soon after this endorsement, not only because of it, we got some funding from ZonMW, a Dutch funder, but also from the Philips Foundation, which I still have to add to this slide actually. And the next slide shows what we did there. We basically set up, forget for now the orange boxes. These are the typical established knowledge databases like genomics databases at EBI, NCBI, Human Protein Atlas, and in companies. But what we need in VODAN, in the COVID epidemic, is access to real world observations, which is represented by the green dots. And with the modest funding that we got the WHO case report form in FAIR format. So when people fill it in, the output is FAIR data, and they are directed to these green dots, the FAIR data points. And specifically the funding from Philips Foundation was aimed at Africa. So in Africa alone, we already have 9 FAIR data points over 7 different countries, but also in the Netherlands. We just had one in China. We have several in the United States. So what we have already showed is that you can now send trains, which are actually Sparkle queries at this point, but it will be much more sophisticated soon. And they travel around visiting the data and get some results. The next slide. This is always going wrong in PowerPoint, sorry for that. But basically the whole idea of an internet of FAIR data and services would be that applications travel to data and they need infrastructure at the point where they operate. And all 3 of those important elements are need FAIR metadata to make this happen, machine readable metadata. And we just finished 6 workshops for the conference that was mentioned earlier, including, for example, 7 major pharma companies, but also a lot of S3s like connected in ENVI FAIR, going all the way from material sciences to health. And they made their FAIR implementation profile declaring in a machine readable format how they approach this. And this is really a breakthrough, I think, that was initiated by VODAN. Next slide, please. Just to give you an artist impression, I'm not going as a biologist in the details of this, but by finally getting access to these data globally, we found out that people in COVID die from vascular leakage and thrombosis, a combination caused by cytokine storm. This is probably some terms all of you have heard of. And there's 46 genes involved, and this was only possible by combining real-world observations and 275 databases from established knowledge. Next slide. Again, just an artist impression here. And we have thrown all the drugs that were at that time, this is a slide of a few months old, that were tested and reported in Wikidata for COVID. And you will see, if you would be able to really study this, but that's not what we have on the table today, that hydroxychloroquine, for example, scores very low in this model, but dexamethasone, tocilizumab, and lidocaine, a number of drugs that are really used now or evaluated, scored very high. So machines, based on FAIR data, could predict this. But the problem is, going back to my second slide, that we cannot access the data because they're closed off in silos in the countries that don't want to share them, which for COVID comes on top of the normal GDPR issues. Next slide. This is a project we got funded through VODAN. Well, it's not a VODAN project. It was funded by the top sector Health in the Netherlands with 1.2 million new funding, but also a lot of input from the companies. And I don't want to say much about it, but this is the first instantiation where patient data coming from a WHO report form or from measurements in our hospital or from self-reporting apps are all made fair. The citizen can direct the data to a FAIR data point, give it a machine-readable consent file as metadata, and these can be analyzed with the GDPR-compliant distributed analytics. This project, in my view, would not have been granted if we could not show initial results that were created under VODAN. And my final point is that I think that the endorsement and the collaboration that we now have created in the Data Together group is a crucial element in these things. And together we would also be much stronger in getting formal roles in the regional open science cloud type initiatives that were mentioned by previous speakers. Thank you. Over to Hilary, I think.
That's it. Thank you, Barend. Federico, could I ask you to go to the next slide for me, please? Okay, so we talked, Barend and Mark have given good examples of how we, earlier this year, I suppose, we worked together as the 4 organizations. And that some of that work is still, of course, continuing. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some future plans, and then I'll hand to Simon after my 2 slides about another initiative. So where we would like to see the data together in the support of the European Open Science Cloud. And I'll focus a little bit on this international socio-technical alignment. Federico, could I ask you for the next slide, please? So in May this year, of course, the European partnership under the Horizon Europe program was launched for the Open Science Cloud partnership. And there are some different references to the 4 organizations and our Data Together activities in it. But I think what I wanted to show from this extract here is how it is in a way a two-way street, or the dual benefits both for the European Open Science Cloud and also for the organization. So from the organizational point of view, as you can see in the screen, the European Open Science Cloud would, and we hope, support us in our data-oriented missions. And we hope that we can bring the international and the connections and support and the connections from the rest of the globe. So while we understand that the European Open Science Cloud is the huge investment in Europe, obviously the avoiding silos, avoiding the duplication of efforts, not doing things in isolation is imperative. and the Research Data Alliance, CODATA, WDS and GoFair can all bring their complementarities and synergies that Ingrid highlighted at the very beginning to the table. We hope to support this. So in my next slide, concretely, if you like, there are two ways under which, so in the Infra EOSC 03 call, that's a code name from some of you, but anyway, the EOSC portal call that should be funded for next year. There are two concrete ways that we hope to support, and we would like to do this, even though it's, shall we say, the Research Data Alliance is directly involved in the project. We hope that this will be done as a data together activity, because as Ingrid says, it's a coalition of the willing, and what we can do together, we very much believe brings support to the community and value to the community. So the two main high-level strands, because we won't go into the detail of it now, are supporting these research and science communities. So obviously the whole FAIR data aspect and data interoperability are imperative for the Open Science Cloud, and to ensure also that scientific and research communities, that there are some that we know that are well prepared and well involved in the discussions in Europe, perhaps through the ESFRIs, the European research infrastructures, but there are many other communities around the globe that don't have geographical borders or don't have structures, that perhaps are a little less aware of or unprepared for engaging with the European Open Science Cloud. And we would like to support in that, yes, so that's sort of on a high level thing. And then of course this engagement with global open science initiatives, so this internationalization, because that will happen on many levels with many stakeholders, but of course it's very important that it does take place to avoid those silos. One of the aspects is, well, RDA has this mechanism in Europe to support standardization and the creation of standards, and we will leverage upon that together, but also through the Global Open Research Commons interest group, which is bringing together already many of the different research commons and clouds and initiatives that are, and data commons that are springing up across the world, and the International Benchmarking Working Group, which is just about to start. And while this is some concrete activity, it's not just confined to us, because the concept also would be that the European community will be asked to get involved, and we'll have open calls to support experts to support these activities, which we hope will start in the middle of 2021. So that's really about those highlights. I'm going to pass over to Simon, who is going to give you his insights on the other initiative that we want to start working on together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hilary. I see that this slide has messed up a little bit on the right-hand side there. So I'm going to talk about an initiative which comes from outside of Europe, but is intended to be complementary to the activities that Hilary has just presented. So this is a project called the Global Open Science Cloud project. It's a 5-year funded project funded by the Chinese Academy of Science, led by the Computer Network Information Center, which is one of the foci of CODATA cooperation in China. And the activities which this project will undertake, as I said, are intended to be complementary to what Hilary just described. As we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years, there has been a growth in these types of international cooperation in the development of research infrastructures, and then a tendency to try and align research infrastructures from different domains. There are a number of drivers for that: economies of scale, increasing the propagation, if you like, of ideas of open science, of FAIR data and its predecessors, but also this idea of trying to avoid the development of domain silos and to support major grand challenge research activities such as those in relation to the current pandemic, but also those research activities which underpin the UN's 2030 agenda, things like the Sustainable Development Goals, disaster risk reduction, the habitat agenda, climate change mitigation, and adaptation. To do that, we need major research investments in research infrastructures and the interoperability of those research infrastructures. That interoperability is not just the interoperability of data, although that's fundamentally important. It's also the interoperability of procedures, agreements, policies, to some extent, shared responsibility for funding those infrastructures without which research activities cannot operate. So things like the core resources or the essential resources which we need in certain domains. Those are the sort of topics that the EOSC project will seek to address. The outcomes of the project, the 5-year project, we hope will be agreements, at least framework agreements on cooperation between the major global open science platform initiatives. Agreements to cooperate, technical alignment, and we hope some policy alignment as well. The sort of outputs which will lead to that include framework agreements on policies, on data standards and interoperability, on infrastructure alignment and shared and core resources, as I've explained. The first major activity of that project will be an international conference on open science clouds, which we hope will be possible to organize in person in late 2021. We're currently tentatively planning for September, and there will certainly be preparatory virtual workshops in the build up to that. The project very much came out of a set of workshops which were held at the CODATA 2019 Beijing conference, and they involved participants in the Global Open Research Commons working group and interest group from RDA, for example, as well as other stakeholders. So even in its genesis, this was an initiative and a project which involved a number of the Data Together organizations. At the moment, we have the project approved, or our colleagues in China have the project approved. They have invited a small CODATA working group to prepare a draft project plan in the first instance. Mark and Barend, who are on this call, are involved with that. Once we've got that fleshed out, we will share it with the Data Together organizations and bring in other stakeholders. There is more information on that activity we held a workshop a couple of weeks ago at the EGI conference. The link there takes you to the presentations and I think the recordings which were of the presentations that were given at the EGI conference. The Beijing Declaration, which is linked there, came out of the workshop that I've mentioned in Beijing last year. And there will be a panel session at the International FAIR Convergence Symposium. Unfortunately, the image, at least as I see it, sits over that link, but I've put it into the chat. And that's all from me about the EOSC, or the Global Open Science Cloud project. Next slide, please. And I think now we move over to the question and answer.
Yes, thank you very much. I would say if you have any questions, please put them into the chat. And I've asked Simon to kind of mediate this, to manage this. So if you have any questions that have not been answered yet, I've seen that some of the people had already asked a few questions which were answered on the spot. But you may have some more fundamental questions. Please raise your hand or put them into the chat.
So
could say something on the Gaia X
froze
question.
for me for a moment. Sorry,
Yeah,
Barend, I was just saying that things froze.
Okay, well, there is a question on Gaia X. This is really not necessarily for us to answer. I can say something about it, but this is a mostly German-French initiative, and I don't know whether anyone else wants to answer. If I give an answer, it's my personal perspective, not an official answer. Certainly not the Data Together answer.
Well, I can say something about it also, Barend, because I know that
Okay.
in the executive board of the EOSC, there is a discussion about this. We had the subject also on the table of the Secretariat, but then we decided that this was really something that would be first be reviewed by the executive board. So they are looking in terms of, okay, what is the official statement in terms of what the EOSC would make vis-a-vis the developments that we see within Gaia-X.
Yeah, maybe one addition there. I think the Gaia-X initiative really focuses largely on the infrastructure and compute side of things, while of course EOSC is much broader. It needs the infrastructure, definitely, but it is also the data and the services and the software, of course, that is running on the cloud. And I think it's also inspired by this idea that the majority of the cloud market is in the hands of American companies, and so it's more like a semi-industrial approach. So we keep it a close watch. We will work with EOSC wherever possible to support it, but it's not really something that Data Together is in my view core to that initiative.
I see in the chat that we're informed that Emmanuel Mondon has raised his hand, but I think his hand has been raised from the start of the meeting. So I think that's a hangover, and there have been a number of, I don't think we have a capacity to unmute people, at least, or perhaps we do.
Yeah, and I answered his question on Solid.
Yeah, I think those questions
chat.
have been answered, but Emmanuel, do you want to come in and ask another question?
Yes, good afternoon to everybody. Thanks for your answer regarding Gaia-X. I disagree with you, Barend. Gaia-X is not about infrastructure. It's all about data management. So that's why I raised my point about Gaia-X. Last week, they had a 2-day summit. It was full about data management, data space, using data, creating data from European companies for Europe, citizen and business, leveraging European infrastructure. I'm a bit outside of both EOSC and Gaia-X, but from a distant view, we should all align, because otherwise,
of course we should, yeah.
It's a disaster. Lots of money invested on both initiatives. We could say EOSC, European Open Science Cloud, is science and Gaia-X is industry. I mean, someone should be clear about this somewhere.
Well, thank you very much. And indeed, the more they move in the direction of actually dealing with the content of data, the more the Data Together group would be valuable also to them. And certainly agreed on trying to find the synergy between all these initiatives.
It's all about data space, huh? Gaia-X. So for me, it's only data.
I know.
Hilary, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I know, Emmanuel, in the context of the project that I talked about, the EOSC portal, clearly, of course, the public-private aspects are central to it, and Gaia-X is one of them, including the European data spaces and other ones. So I don't think, as Barend rightly answered, we don't have any formal connection with them as Data Together, but that doesn't mean we can't have going forward.
I think you should have sooner than later. Thanks.
Thank you. Good.
Okay. There's a question from an anonymous attendee about EOSC, which I would like to take. Is Data Together involved in EOSC? What other European initiatives are participating? What about outside Europe and Asia? So there are a number of global initiatives which have been mentioned on this call. For example, there is an African open science platform which will be launched. The first executive director of that initiative has been, or is in the process of being appointed. There is a Malaysian Open Science Cloud initiative, and there are efforts to extend that activity to the ASEAN region in Southeast Asia. There is the Australian Research Data Commons, which is a major activity and has a number of developments and approaches from which I think we can all learn. The Canadians, with an initiative called ENDRIO, are also trying to accelerate their research infrastructure, organization, and platforms. So certainly that GOSC project is intended to encourage cooperation and, to the greatest extent possible, some alignment between those type of initiatives. I should mention also Red Clara and La Referencia in Latin America, sort of an NREN coordination activity and a coordination of repositories moving into data as well. So we've also got some dialogue with those initiatives. Science is global. Data for science is global, and therefore these initiatives and their cooperation at that global level are essential. And finally, if I may, I'd add the progress that's being made with open science principles and the proposed adoption of a UNESCO recommendation at the UNESCO General Assembly in November next year will also be a significant development. And from that, we hope to see a number of additional coordinating activities which reference the UNESCO recommendation and will allow us to develop increased infrastructural and procedural policy and technology cooperation.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question and then we have to wrap up. It's almost 3 o'clock Central European time.
So there's a rather long question from Hans Pfeffenberger, but I'm not entirely sure where the question is. Who or which of your organizations is to deal with government agencies, not to speak of commercial entities? I would be grateful if Hans could raise his hand and perhaps we could give him the floor to explain his question a little bit more. If Hans can be unmuted. Okay, Hans, the floor is yours.
I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, the point is, and I found it inspiring that it seems that medical professionals have contributed to this COVID initiative for RDA, which is not necessarily to be expected from my experience of the 2010s. Now, the next point is, of course, government agencies. We know that the European Space Agency is giving data, making data openly available. But, for example, the Italian Space Agency provides their data only on very onerous terms, I think, as at least one must be afraid to use it or to do anything with it. This is why I cited these terms or part of these terms of the data use contract. And so who would be working with government agencies, whether it's a space agency or a health agency such as the CDC in the US or ECDC, I think it's in Europe or whatever, that they provide the data on terms which are actually amenable to science?
So thank you, Hans. I think that's a very good question. There are different agencies for different types of data. Some of them we have strong links with, others less so. Certainly in the SDG and the disaster risk reduction, we're engaging with UN bodies and increasing with statistical agencies. On the health side, with WHO to some extent, less directly with CDCs and their equivalents. I don't know whether other panelists would like to answer that question, but I think there is, you point, Hans, to a fundamental challenge, which is this, sometimes this disconnect between the data that is gathered for policy monitoring at the statistical level and the use that science would want to make of those data and the contribution that science can make to those data, and to understanding the challenge more generally. There's a big debate about that in relation to the SDGs, and a big push for more effective data gathering for SDGs for the scientific contribution to SDGs. And we certainly need to do the same in terms of infectious diseases and other grand challenge issues. Would anyone else like to come in on that issue, on that question?
I would like to possibly close the session now, because I see we have 1 minute to go, and I know that a lot of people have to run for another meeting. So I would say that we can take this offline. If we can discuss a little bit more over this subject, that would be fine. Let me first thank everybody for listening in and for having some very good questions. I can see from the chat that possibly the next webinar should be about Gaia X, because I see a lot of comments on that subject. So that might be something for us to actually think about. Then, of course, I'd like to thank all the speakers and the mediators, and a special thank to the people from Trust IT, who have helped us with the logistics. All presentations and slides are recorded, and you can find them on the EOSC Secretariat website, also known as the liaison platform. I have already seen it in the chat box, links to it, and otherwise you can always find it if you Google on it. You can also contact me directly if you cannot find these things back. So yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for listening in, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Bert. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Bye.